It began with a gunshot, not on a battlefield, not in a war, but on a quiet summer morning in Sarajevo. One moment the world was at peace. Empires glittered, monarchs smiled for photographs, and millions believed civilization had reached its golden age. And then, in less than 6 weeks, that illusion would burn to ashes. June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, arrived in Sarajevo, the restless capital of Bosnia, a province simmering with tension. Nationalism was rising, and the Balkan powder keg was ready to explode. When the Archduke's motorcade drove through the city streets, a group of young conspirators waited. They called themselves the Black Hand, men barely out of their teens, filled with dreams of freedom and vengeance. The first attempt failed. A bomb thrown at the car bounced off and exploded behind it, injuring several officers. The Archduke, shaken but alive, decided to continue his schedule. Hours later, after visiting the wounded at the hospital, his driver took a wrong turn. As the car reversed to correct its path, a man stepped forward, Gavrilo Princip. 2 gunshots echoed through the street. The Archduke and his wife Sophie slumped in their seats. Within minutes, they were dead. To the world, it seemed like another Balkan tragedy. Dramatic, yes, but local. But in the drawing rooms and foreign ministries of Europe, the ripples of those bullets spread fast. The Austro-Hungarian Empire saw an opportunity. For years, it had been watching Serbia grow stronger. The small, defiant kingdom that had humiliated Austria in the Balkans. Now Vienna had its pretext for revenge. In the following days, diplomats exchanged notes, ambassadors carried urgent messages, and generals whispered plans. But the mood was deceptive. Europe had been through crises before. Morocco, the Balkans, the Agadir incident, and each time, the powers had stepped back from the edge. Surely they would again. Surely no one would risk everything. They were wrong. In Vienna, the foreign minister, Count Leopold Berchtold, urged swift action. The empire's pride was at stake, he said. If Austria did not crush Serbia, it would crumble from within. But there was hesitation. The generals warned that Russia might intervene to protect Serbia. Austria needed reassurance from its powerful ally Germany. On July 5, 1914, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II met with the Austrian ambassador. He listened to their grievances and, with remarkable confidence, gave what history would call the blank check. Germany would support Austria-Hungary no matter what, even if it meant war with Russia. It was a fatal promise. For the next 2 weeks, Vienna moved slowly, too slowly. While Austria deliberated, public outrage cooled. The world waited, uncertain. Even Germany began to grow impatient. But behind the scenes, the military machines were already stirring. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II watched nervously. He did not want war, but he could not abandon Serbia, his fellow Slavs. In Paris, President Poincaré prepared for a diplomatic trip to Russia, hoping to strengthen the alliance. In London, the British cabinet debated neutrality, believing this would be just another regional quarrel. Then, on July 23, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia. It was written with precision and poison. Serbia was given 48 hours to accept every demand. Suppress all anti-Austrian movements, dismiss certain officials, and allow Austrian police to operate inside Serbia's borders. No sovereign nation could fully accept such terms. It was designed to be rejected. Across Europe, diplomats gasped. The German Foreign Secretary, Jago, called it too harsh. In London, the British Foreign Minister, Sir Edward Grey, said, "If this is not modified, it means war." In St. Petersburg, the Tsar's ministers warned that Russia could not stand idle. But in Vienna, the ultimatum was seen as justice, a final warning before retribution. On July 25th, Serbia replied. They accepted most of the demands, even humiliating ones, but politely refused the clauses that infringed their sovereignty. To any reasonable mind, it was enough for peace. But Austria had already made up its mind. At 6 p.m. that evening, the Austrian ambassador left Belgrade. Within hours, Serbian troops began mobilizing. And across Europe, telegrams started flying, coded, urgent, desperate. The countdown had begun. In Berlin, the Kaiser was on his yacht, the Hohenzollern, when he received Serbia's response. He read it twice, then smiled. "A brilliant piece of diplomacy," he said. "With this, every reason for war disappears." For a brief moment, peace seemed possible. But back in Vienna, the generals had already taken control. They wanted a short, decisive war before Russia could react. And on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Shells began falling on Belgrade. The first shots of the Great War had been fired. The guns of Austria thundered across the Danube, and the world held its breath. For the first time in decades, Europe was watching two nations go to war, and no one knew where it would stop. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar faced an impossible choice. His generals warned that if Serbia fell, Russia's influence in the Balkans would vanish. But full mobilization meant confronting Germany, and Nicholas II still hoped to avoid that nightmare. He sent a telegram to Berlin, a personal message to his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm. They called each other Nicky and Willie, rulers of empires bound by family but divided by alliances. For 2 days, they exchanged desperate telegrams. "Dearest Willie," the Tsar wrote, "an ignoble war has been declared. I beg you to do all in your power to restrain your ally." Wilhelm replied, "I cannot see why your mobilization is necessary. If you mobilize, my hand will be forced." It was a tragic correspondence. Cousins pleading for peace while their armies prepared for destruction. On July 30th, 1914, Russia ordered general mobilization. It was meant as a warning, but in the age of railways and telegraphs, mobilization meant only one thing: war. In Berlin, the Kaiser's military advisors pressed him to act. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's war strategy, could not wait. It relied on speed. Strike France first, defeat her quickly, and then turn east against the slow-moving Russian army. The clock was ticking. On July 31st, Germany issued ultimatums to both Russia and France. To Russia, stop mobilization within 12 hours. To France, remain neutral if war came between Germany and Russia. Neither ultimatum was answered in time. At 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. The madness had begun. Crowds filled the streets of Berlin, waving flags, singing songs, cheering for a war they believed would be over by Christmas. Trains loaded with soldiers rolled out of stations covered in flowers and smiles. Few realized they were heading into a storm that would last 4 years and consume an entire generation. That same evening, Wilhelm sent one last telegram to his cousin. "I have just received the news of the Russian mobilization. My friendship for you and your country has always been sincere, but now we must meet as enemies." And just like that, the two greatest empires of Europe were at war. France, bound by treaty to Russia, now faced the inevitable. President Poincaré returned from his visit to St. Petersburg aboard a battleship, already hearing the echoes of mobilization orders. The French army prepared to defend its borders, but they knew what was coming. The German plan to invade through Belgium. Belgium was neutral, protected by international treaties since 1839. Even Britain had guaranteed that neutrality. But for the German generals, it was merely a road, the fastest path to Paris. On August 2nd, German troops crossed into Luxembourg and demanded passage through Belgium. King Albert refused. "Belgium is a nation, not a road," he said. And so Germany invaded. The world now faced a new reality. A war of alliances, not just nations. In London, confusion reigned. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith's cabinet was divided. Some wanted neutrality, others believed Britain must defend France and Belgium. The British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, watched the gas lamps being lit along the Thames that evening and said quietly, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." It was one of the most haunting sentences ever spoken, and it was true. On August 4th, 1914, at 11 p.m., Britain declared war on Germany. The Empire followed. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa all joined the fight. In just 5 weeks, a single gunshot in Sarajevo had dragged the entire world into catastrophe. What began as a local conflict had become a global war. Across Europe, the mobilization was total. In Paris, women wept as they watched their sons march away. In Vienna, officers toasted victory and revenge. In Berlin, the streets rang with patriotic songs. And in small villages from Scotland to Serbia, farmers put down their tools, kissed their families goodbye, and walked to the trains. But beneath the cheers and flags, there was fear. No one truly knew what they were fighting for or how far it would go. In the following days, the armies moved with clockwork precision. The German forces swept through Belgium, burning towns, executing civilians, and destroying everything in their path. The world was horrified, but the machine rolled on. In France, the soldiers wore bright red trousers and blue coats, relics of another era. They marched into modern warfare with 19th-century tactics. Machine guns and artillery tore them apart by the thousands. By the end of August, the illusion of a quick war was already dying. But the governments pressed on. No one wanted to be the first to admit the madness had gone too far. And so, in a single month, July to August 1914, civilization shattered. Old Europe, with its kings, courts, and empires, vanished almost overnight. The July crisis was not a plan. It was a chain reaction. Pride, fear, and arrogance colliding at once. Each leader believed he was acting in defense. Each thought the others would back down. And each, in the end, unleashed something far beyond their control. As Europe descended into chaos, diplomats everywhere looked back in disbelief. How had it come to this? For years they had warned of war, but none imagined it would arrive so swiftly, so completely. The July crisis had lasted just 37 days. 37 days to unravel a century of peace. In Vienna, the leaders who had demanded justice for the Archduke now found themselves overwhelmed by a war far greater than they had envisioned. Austria's generals expected a quick victory over Serbia, but the campaign stalled almost immediately. The mountains, the rivers, the fierce resistance. Nothing went as planned. And soon they faced not just Serbia but Russia as well. In Berlin, the Kaiser still tried to believe that fate had chosen him to defend Germany's honor. But as the trains rolled east and west, as reports of casualties arrived, even he began to sense the scale of what had begun. "This is not what I wanted," he murmured to his aides. But it was far too late. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas prayed for strength. His ministers spoke of victory, but his heart was heavy. He had hoped to protect Serbia. Instead, he had condemned his empire to suffering it could scarcely imagine. Within 3 years, revolution would sweep his dynasty away. The war he entered as a monarch, he would end as a prisoner. In Paris, the streets filled with tricolor flags. People sang La Marseillaise, shouted "À Berlin," and threw flowers to departing soldiers. But in the quiet of the government offices, the ministers looked grim. They had fought Germany before. They knew the price. One French officer wrote in his diary that night, "We march to defend civilization, but I wonder if civilization is already lost." In London, the news of war spread slowly. For most, it was still unthinkable that Britain, the world's greatest empire, was now entering a continental conflict. The crowds cheered as soldiers paraded through the streets, but the mood was uncertain, uneasy. Gray's words about the lamps going out echoed in the air. From the far reaches of the empire, volunteers began to gather. Canadians, Indians, Australians, men who had never seen Europe but would soon die on its fields. A war that had begun with empires defending their pride now summoned their colonies to die for them. By mid-August, Europe was at war from the North Sea to the Balkans. The alliances had become chains. The politicians had handed the world to the generals. For the soldiers at the front, the reality was immediate and brutal. The thunder of guns, the endless marches, the confusion of new technology, machine guns, barbed wire, airplanes, poison gas. None of them had imagined this kind of war. They had marched off singing. Soon, they would dig trenches and wait for years. As the fighting began, each capital tried to shape the story. Propaganda turned every government into a victim, every enemy into a monster. In Germany, posters claimed they were defending civilization from Slavic barbarism. In Russia, they spoke of protecting the Slavs from Teutonic aggression. In Britain, the invasion of Belgium became the proof that Germany's militarism had to be stopped. The truth was simpler and far darker. It was not a war for ideals, nor for glory. It was a war born from fear, ambition, and pride. Historians would later search for a single villain, a single trigger, a single decision that made it inevitable. But there was no one moment, no one man. The July crisis was a web of miscalculations and arrogance, where every leader believed he was acting rationally. The Austrians wanted revenge. The Germans feared encirclement. The Russians feared humiliation. The French wanted justice for 1871. And Britain feared the balance of power collapsing forever. Each moved one step closer and the world fell off the edge. By the time the first battles were fought, the Marne, Tannenberg, Mons, millions were already dead or wounded. And the war was just beginning. The war to end all wars had arrived. But the men who started it, emperors, ministers, kings, could not control it anymore. The machinery they had built now moved on its own, fueled by hatred, nationalism, and industrial might. The world had become a battlefield. In the quiet that followed those first weeks, as the front lines settled into trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the sea, Europe realized what it had done. The optimism of the Belle Époque was gone. The music halls, the grand cafes, the royal parades, all replaced by mud, blood, and silence. A British soldier wrote home from France, "The world I knew has ended. We live in a time of iron." The July crisis of 1914 remains one of history's great lessons, not only of how wars begin, but how peace dies. It showed how pride can blind reason, how fear can turn allies into enemies, and how a single moment, a wrong turn on a Sarajevo street, can destroy everything. By August, the world was at war, and nothing would ever be the same again. For centuries, Europe had called itself the pinnacle of civilization, a continent of progress, science, and art. But in 1914, that civilization tore itself apart. The kings and emperors who had smiled in family portraits now sent millions to die in their names. The diplomats who believed they could control events found themselves swept aside by the tide of violence. And the people, the farmers, workers, students, became the victims of decisions made in gilded rooms. It is said that history does not repeat, but it rhymes. The July crisis reminds us that wars are not born from evil alone, but from the failure to imagine their consequences. In 1914, Europe could not imagine the trenches, the gas, the destruction of cities, the fall of empires, and so it walked, step by step, into the abyss. When the guns finally fell silent 4 years later, more than 16 million were dead. For empires had vanished, and a new world, wounded and angry, was ready to begin again. A world that would, within a generation, ignite once more. They called it the Great War, but it began as something smaller, a crisis, a quarrel, a test of wills. In the summer of 1914, the most advanced civilization on Earth lost its mind. The day Europe went mad was the day the modern world was born.